They thought cutting me out would keep their secret safe. But how would you react if your mother whispered, "Stay calm," while your sister laughed and said, "That was last week"? I walked away without a word. 7 days later, their mansion was gone, their names plastered on every headline, and my silence was all it took. I'm Clara Mitchell, and this is how betrayal turned into poetic justice. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Friday evening in Seattle. The Mitchell house sat on the quiet edge of Lakeview, its warm light spilling into the misty blue outside. I parked in the driveway, hands tight on the steering wheel, rehearsing what I'd say. 2 weeks away in Portland, another corporate event completed, and now I was home for what I believed would be my sister's wedding weekend. In the passenger seat sat a pale gold box wrapped with white ribbon, the wedding gift I'd chosen for Grace. Inside, the air smelled of roasted beef and red wine. My mother Evelyn stood at the dining table, arranging silver cutlery with her usual precision. The table gleamed under the chandelier. My father Robert was at the end of the table, flipping through papers from work, a glass of Cabernet beside him. It looked like a perfect family dinner. For a second, I almost believed it. Clara Mom said, her voice light but careful, "You made it back early." "I wanted to," I said, hanging my coat. Didn't want to miss the final dinner before the big day. Grace was sitting diagonally across from me, phone in hand, scrolling. The screen's light reflected in her eyes. She didn't look up. "You always make everything sound dramatic," she said, half laughing. Mom gave her a look. Grace put the phone down. "Be present." I smiled, trying to brush off the tension. "So, how are things going? You ready for tomorrow?" Grace sipped her wine, eyes still on her phone. The wedding," I said, my tone teasing. "Tomorrow's the big day, right?" For a moment, there was silence so sharp it sliced through the hum of the refrigerator. My mother's hand trembled as she set down her glass. The clink against the plate sounded too loud. My father cleared his throat and looked down at his wine. Grace finally looked up, her lips curled into a smile, faint but deliberate. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "don't worry about it. The wedding was last week." The words didn't land immediately. They floated there absurd like a bad joke. I blinked, confused, laughing once out of disbelief. "Last week, no Grace. Look," I reached for the invitation tucked beside my plate. "It says Saturday, March 8th. My voice thinned. "That's tomorrow." Mom's voice came out barely above a whisper. "There was a last-minute change. We printed the wrong date." I looked from her to Dad. He didn't meet my eyes. He poured himself more wine instead, the deep red sliding into his glass like blood. "Things got complicated," he muttered. Grace set her phone down finally. "It just made more sense to do it earlier. A smaller ceremony, less stress." Without telling me, I asked. My tone wasn't raised, but it carried something that made her flinch. "You held your wedding. You said nothing." Grace rolled her shoulders. "You're always so busy, Clara. You probably couldn't have come anyway." My heart thudded once hard. Busy. That word they always used to excuse their distance. I felt my pulse at my temples. "I rearranged my entire schedule for this," I said. I stopped myself. I saw their faces. Mom's pale, Dad's blank, Grace's smug, calm. And realized no explanation mattered. I exhaled slowly, setting the invitation down. The ink glared back at me, mocking. March 8th. I folded the napkin on my lap, smoothing its crease before laying it neatly on the table. "Congratulations, Grace," I said quietly. "Clara." Mom started, but I stood. "It's fine," I said. "Truly. You got what you wanted." I glanced at Grace's ring. A diamond sparkling under the light, new and cold. I hope it was perfect. My chair scraped softly against the hardwood. The only sound after that was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I walked toward the foyer heels, clicking like measured steps in a corridor. No one followed. No one said a word. At the door, I paused just long enough to feel the weight in my chest settle into something colder, clearer. I picked up my coat, my gift still resting untouched on the counter, and left it there. Outside, the air was sharp, damp with the smell of the lake. I closed the door behind me. The click echoed in the quiet. I drove away without looking back, the reflection of the house shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was nothing but light fading into fog. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. I wasn't angry. I was done. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even wonder why they'd done it, because deep down, I already knew. They had been pulling away for years, one small omission at a time, until this final cut left nothing to question. I parked by the lake a few blocks away and sat there, engine humming softly. The invitation lay on the passenger seat. I picked it up, ran my thumb over the gold letters. March 8th. My laugh was quiet, hollow. I wasn't angry. I just knew exactly what I needed to do. In the dining room I'd left behind, Grace leaned toward my mother. Voice hushed. "See, I told you she'd make it a scene." Evelyn's reply was almost a whisper. "You don't understand, Grace. You have no idea how frightening her silence can be." Rain traced slow lines down my living room window, blurring the view of downtown Seattle into pale gold and gray. The city was waking up coffee shops, opening buses, groaning through the drizzle. I sat on the sofa in my robe, holding a mug that had long gone cold. The wedding invitation lay on the coffee table, beside the unopened gift box, its gold ribbons still perfect untouched. I stared at that invitation, the embossed lettering shining faintly under the lamp. My name was written neatly under guest, as if I'd been wanted there. As if it hadn't all been a lie, I reached for my laptop, instead opened the folder labeled Family Finances, and stared at the long list of transactions that spelled out years of blind loyalty. In 2000, Grace's call came at 2 a.m. Her voice cracked through the phone. "Clara, please. The supplier backed out the rent's overdue. I'll lose everything. I didn't even ask for details. I wired her $50,000 before sunrise. She promised she'd pay me back after her boutique turned around. It never did. She never mentioned it again. In 2019, Mom called me in tears about the leaking roof at the Lakeview house, the one they loved more than any person who ever lived inside it. It's collapsing, sweetheart. We need $120,000 at least. I pulled from my savings the one I'd meant for my first real office. Don't worry, Mom." I'd said then, that's what family's for. In 2020, Dad's voice on speakerphone, calm but desperate. "Mitchell Holdings is going under. We just need a bridge loan. $1 million, maybe a little more. It's temporary." He said I was still one of them. I wired $1.2 million. He sent a thank you email that read like a business memo. "Appreciate your support." No signature, no love. Now 2 years later, they'd held a wedding behind my back. The numbers glowed cold on the screen, decimals and dates that no longer meant generosity. They meant stupidity. I scrolled down, watching the balance shrink line by line. Every wire was a piece of me I'd handed over. I had built them a safety net, and they'd used it to hang me. I shut the laptop with a soft click and leaned back, letting the silence hum around me. The rain thickened, streaking faster down the window. My reflections stared back, hair-messy eyes, tired but sharp. I thought of Grace's smirk the night before, the way she said, "Don't worry about it." It wasn't just cruel, it was planned. They had decided I didn't belong. I reached for the invitation again, folded it once, then again, until the thick paper bent unevenly. My hand shook with something colder than anger. I wasn't going to beg for inclusion. I wasn't even going to confront them. I wanted them to feel the absence they'd created. I pulled open a drawer and took out a small box, receipts, copies of checks, tax forms. I flipped through them one by one, the proof of everything I'd done for them. Each signature in my name, every note labeled family support. I rolled the papers into a tight bundle and dropped it into the trash can. The sound was quiet, final. They would never see me plead again. The apartment felt bigger than usual, the kind of emptiness that echoed if you moved too fast. I walked to the kitchen, poured the cold coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, and stood there watching the steam rise from the drain. I felt strange. Steady. Detached. Like the part of me that had always reached out to them had finally gone still. The phone buzzed on the counter. The screen read Aunt Nora. I hesitated before answering. "Hi, honey." Her voice came through low and rough, the kind of voice that had smoked too many cigarettes and said too many truths. "Are you all right?" I stared at the rain outside. "I'm fine," I said. "You heard, didn't you?" "I was there," I said quietly. "I heard her say it." There was a pause. the sound of Nora's sigh filling the line. I wanted to call you last week. I thought maybe they'd tell you themselves. They didn't, I said. But it's okay. They taught me something. What's that? That silence can be an answer too, Nora exhaled, almost a laugh, but sad. They did hide it from you, Clara. Your mother knew. She didn't even argue. Grace said she didn't want you there. Too much attention, she said. I know. I whispered. My reflection in the glass looked calm, too calm. I guessed as much. She's always been jealous, Nora said softly. You have what she wants. Respect independence. Evelyn never could balance that between you. I let her words hang there, then said, This isn't about jealousy anymore. What's it about then? Boundaries. The line went quiet again. Rain drummed against the windows, steady and deliberate. Are you going to do something? Nora finally asked. Yes, I said. But not what they expect, she hesitated. Do you need help? Not yet. I looked at the notebook on the counter, its pages still blank from last month's planning retreat. I picked up a pen and wrote 2 words in the corner of a fresh page. Maggie Reed. I'll call you soon, I told Nora. Promise me you won't do anything rash, she said, her tone tightening. I won't. I said, I'm done being rash. I'm done being the first to fix everything. We said goodbye. I ended the call and stood there for a while listening to the rain fade into a soft hiss. In the distance, a siren wailed somewhere near the waterfront. The sound rose, then disappeared, swallowed by the city. I walked to the balcony barefoot on the cold wood. The streets below were slick with water, and headlights the kind of morning that smelled like metal and new beginnings. I thought about the years I'd spent earning their approval, paying for their mistakes, being their safety net. I thought about the look on Grace's face when she said the words last week. There was no remorse there, only pride. I wrapped my arms around myself, breathing in the wet air. My anger wasn't loud. It was quiet and precise, like the start of a plan. They thought they'd erased me, but they'd only freed me. Some debts aren't meant to be collected. They're meant to be remembered, and this time they'd remember mine. The rain softened to a drizzle. I closed the notebook, leaving those 2 words on the page, Maggie Reed, a name that would become the line between what they took and what I would take back. I turned off the lights, set the folded invitation on the counter beside the untouched gift, and walked toward my bedroom. Behind me, the city lights glowed through the rain, steady and indifferent. It felt right. Tomorrow would be different. The smell of espresso and rain mixed inside the tiny cafe near Gasworks Park. The place was half empty, the kind of quiet spot where conversations went unnoticed. I spotted Nora in the corner, her coat still damp, her hands wrapped around a cup that had probably gone cold. She looked up when I entered. Clara. Her voice held that soft warning tone she'd used when I was a kid, the one that usually came before bad news. I hung my coat, took the seat across from her. You said you had something to show me. Nora hesitated, then unlocked her phone and turned the screen toward me. Text messages glowed under the dim light. Grace's name at the top. Grace, don't invite Clara. She'll steal attention. I want a perfect wedding. Evelyn. I understand. My stomach tightened. I stared at the words until they blurred. Nora spoke quietly. I didn't want to believe it, but your mother agreed without hesitation. I could hear the hiss of the espresso machine behind me, the murmur of a barista calling a name. Everything else went silent. So that's it, I said. They planned it. Nora nodded. Grace told everyone you were out of the country for work. She made sure nobody questioned why you weren't there. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, which surprised me. All this time I thought maybe I'd done something wrong. But it wasn't about me at all. It was about control. Nora reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. You don't deserve this, sweetheart. No, I said, my voice calm. But I do deserve to know. The silence between us thickened. Outside, the sky over Seattle had turned the color of steel. People hurried past with umbrellas, their shoes splashing through puddles. Nora took a sip of her coffee. Your mother's always cared too much about how the family looks. Grace, she's always been her reflection. They need everything polished, even if it means erasing you. I watched the rain slide down the window. She's afraid I'll remind her who she used to be. What do you mean? Nora asked. She used to be brave, I said, before she started pretending. Nora studied me carefully. What are you going to do now? I didn't answer right away. My eyes drifted back to her phone. That single word, understand, burned like a brand. My mother had understood perfectly. She had chosen her peace over my presence. I'm not going to call them, I said finally. I'm not giving them another explanation to ignore. Nora nodded slowly. That's wise. Then her tone shifted cautious. You remember Maggie Reed? The attorney I told you about, the one who helped my old business partner after her divorce. I nodded. Yeah. Financial law, right? She's sharp. Handles corporate disputes, asset ownership, all of it. If your father ever used your name for the company again, she'd know what to do. I raised my eyes to her. You think they have? Nora hesitated. I don't think Clara. I know. Evelyn mentioned once that your father had you sign something years ago. I doubt you realized what it was. The memory hit like a flash me at 28, at my parents' dining table, Dad saying, just some routine paperwork for tax purposes. I'd signed without reading, trusting him. Nora's expression softened. Maggie could help you find out. You don't need to go to war with them. You just need to take back what's yours. I nodded, absorbing her words. I'm not out for revenge, I said. I just want balance restored. That's what I thought you'd say. Nora leaned back, relief and pride tangled in her smile. You've always been the strong one. Too strong for their comfort. I looked out the window again. The rain was heavier now, slanting in sheets across the street. Maybe that's why they did it, I said softly. People break what they can't control. Nora shook her head. Don't let them make you bitter. I won't. I said, bitterness means I still care. She smiled faintly. You sound like your father used to before the money changed him. I almost laughed. That man sold his conscience for a golf membership. For the first time that day, Nora chuckled. The sound eased something in the air. She reached into her bag and slid a business card across the table. Maggie Reed, Corporate Law, Downtown Seattle. I'll call her, I said, tucking the card into my coat pocket. Do it soon, Nora said. Before they realize they've underestimated you again. We sat in silence for another moment. I could feel her eyes on me, the mix of love and worry. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. You know, when you were little, you used to draw family portraits. You'd always draw yourself standing outside the house. I guess I always knew where I stood, I said. She reached out, squeezing my hand. Then stand tall this time on your own terms. I finished what was left of my coffee, bitter and cold. I will. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake. I stood, pulling on my coat. Nora rose too, touching my arm lightly. You're not alone in this. I know I said, though part of me didn't believe it. I left the cafe. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped out into the rain. It came down harder now, sharp and unrelenting, soaking through my coat in seconds. I didn't bother opening my umbrella. The air smelled like wet concrete and pine. I walked toward the street heels, splashing through puddles, the world around me blurred with water and streetlights. Each drop felt grounding, washing away the last trace of confusion. People rushed past me, shielding their faces, but I kept walking. I wasn't hiding anymore. The truth was ugly, yes, but it was clean, and I could work with clean. At the corner, I stopped, took the business card from my pocket, and looked at Maggie's name again. The letters bled slightly under the rain, but they were still readable. I slid the card back, lifted my chin, and crossed the street. They had erased me from their perfect picture. Now I would draw a new one without them in it. The city looked sharper on Monday mornings, all edges and glass. I parked downtown, slid my umbrella closed, and walked into Reed & Associates, a sleek law firm with a lobby that smelled faintly of lemon and ambition. The receptionist led me down a hallway of glass-walled offices until we reached a door with Maggie Reed-esque etched in silver. Inside, Maggie stood by her desk, sleeves rolled up, a woman who seemed allergic to wasting time. Mid-40s, confident posture, hair tied neatly back. She gestured to a chair before even shaking my hand. Clara Mitchell, she said, scanning me. Nora told me you'd call. I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice. I'm always curious when family and money overlap, she said, sitting. That combination usually burns hotter than gasoline. I placed the folder on her desk. This is everything I have from Mitchell Holdings. Tax forms. Correspondence contracts my father had me sign years ago. I want to know what they mean. She flipped open the folder, skimming through pages quickly, her pen tapping once against her notebook. You have good record-keeping habits, she murmured. Not many people your age keep original signatures. Being the family's crisis manager taught me that. Maggie gave a short, knowing laugh. Every family has one of those. For several minutes, the only sound was the turning of pages. Then she stopped tapping her pen on a document halfway down the stack. "Here," she said. "This is what you were looking for." I leaned forward. "What is it?" She pointed at the header. "Share authorization form. Your name isn't just a guarantor, Clara. You're listed as a 51% shareholder in Mitchell Holdings. Do you realize what that means?" I blinked, trying to process it. "No," I said slowly. "I thought my father just needed my signature for a temporary tax exemption." She leaned back. "He used your name to stabilize his credit line. It made the company appear solvent because you have better standing and no liens, but legally, you're the majority owner." My heart thudded once sharply. "And if I withdraw my shares?" Her gaze was steady. "They lose everything. The loans they've secured against your name collapse. The foundation of their finances." Mitchell Holdings. The trust accounts, even the Evergreen Foundation, depends on that authorization staying active. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "So if I walk away, they drown." "Essentially," she said. "The market's already unstable. One signature could send the whole structure down." The irony hit hard. For years I'd been their safety net, the one they leaned on, borrowed from, guilted into saving. I had been holding them up without even knowing it. Maggie studied my face. "Do you want to litigate or just pull out?" "Neither." I said. "I don't want a public war. I just want them to face the gravity of what they did." Her brow arched slightly. "Then you withdraw quietly. I can draft the papers today. Once filed, the bank will be notified within 48 hours. Their accounts will freeze automatically." I nodded, my voice low. "Do it." She hesitated, for the first time measuring me. "Clara, you understand this isn't small. You're effectively cutting off the entire family's financial oxygen." I met her gaze. "They cut me out of their lives first." She exhaled, something like respect passing through her eyes. "Fair enough." While she printed the forms, I wandered toward the window. From 30 stories up, the city looked clean, ordered, obedient. The rain had stopped sunlight pushing through the clouds like it was reclaiming the sky. The glass reflected my face faintly. Calm, unreadable. When Maggie returned, she placed a neat stack of documents on the desk. "Sign here and here. Initial the second page." Her voice softened just slightly. "I've handled family cases for 20 years. The people who shout and fight don't scare anyone. It's the quiet ones who end everything with a pen stroke." I picked up the pen. "I'm not trying to scare them." "I didn't say you were," she replied. "I said you'll succeed." The pen glided easily across the page. I signed my name, initials, date. Every letter felt like closure. No tremor, no pause, just precision. When I finished, she gathered the papers, stapled them, and placed them into a blue folder. "It'll take less than 2 days for the withdrawal to register," she said. "They'll probably hear it from their accountant first. After that, expect calls. I won't answer them." She smiled faintly. "You remind me of a client I had once. Woman your age, same story. Her family used her credit to keep their business afloat. She didn't scream either, just walked away. They thought silence meant weakness." "What happened to them?" I asked. "They collapsed within a month," she said simply. I nodded. Not out of satisfaction, but acknowledgement. I didn't need revenge. I needed release. I reached for my coat. "Thank you, Maggie." She held my gaze. "If you need me to act as intermediary when things unravel, I will. No charge. I'll keep that in mind." As I turned to leave, she said quietly, "You know, Clara, when you stop saving them, that's when they'll finally see who held the pieces together." I paused at the door, glancing back. Maybe they'll just see what happens when they lose their mirror. She tilted her head. Either way, they'll see. Outside, the lobby buzzed with people moving briskly, phones ringing heels, clicking, conversations overlapping. I walked through it all, the folder under my arm, the city's air cold against my skin. By the time I stepped back onto the street, clouds had rolled in again. The light turned silver, the kind that made every reflection shimmer. My reflection in a window caught my eye. Steady, composed, untouchable. I wasn't sure if what I felt was relief or grief, maybe both. But beneath it all was clarity. I didn't need to destroy them. I just had to stop holding them up. When I reached my car, I looked once more at the folder before sliding it into the passenger seat. The papers inside represented more than ownership. They were proof that the power they'd stolen had always been mine. I started the engine. Somewhere downtown, the hum of traffic rose like distant thunder. Silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. The Lakeview house looked the same as always, perfect, symmetrical, and soulless. The driveway curved between trimmed hedges, the same ones I'd helped pay for 2 years ago. I parked near the steps, cut the engine, and stared at the house for a moment. The front gate was open. It always was, because they never believed anyone could have the power to walk in and destroy what they'd built. The folder sat on the passenger seat, a thin weight that carried everything. I grabbed it, took a breath, and stepped out. The air smelled like cold stone and wet leaves. Inside, the house was too quiet. The hum of the heater echoed against the marble floor. I passed through the hallway, my heels clicking, a sound that once belonged to my mother. My father's office door was ajar. He sat behind his desk, tie loosened, staring at the last frame of a Zoom meeting on his monitor. When he turned, his expression hardened. "Clara, what are you doing here?" I held up the folder and placed it on his desk. "I came to let you know I've withdrawn my shares from Mitchell Holdings." His brow furrowed. "Your shares." He opened the folder, flipping through the pages. When he saw my signature color drained from his face, You can't just... This affects everything." "I already did," I said simply. He pushed his chair back, standing. "You don't understand, Clara. This will destroy us. The company, the house, everything we've worked for." "No," I said, voice calm. "You don't understand. You destroyed it the day you used my name to hold it up." He stared at me, chest-rising, fists curling against the desk. "I built this family's name. Without me, you wouldn't have what you do." I met his gaze. "What I have, I earned. What you have, you borrowed. From me." He slammed his hand on the desk, the sound sharp. "You're being emotional. That's the difference between us," I said. "You think everything I do comes from emotion. But this is business." The door opened behind me. My mother's voice trembled as she entered. "Clara, please, let's talk calmly." She looked smaller than I remembered, wrapped in a pale sweater like a peace flag. "We're family." I turned to her. "No, Mom. We're people who share a name. That's all." Her lips parted, but no words came. I saw her eyes, afraid, pleading, confused, but I didn't move. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, quick and deliberate. Grace appeared, holding her phone up, camera aimed at me. "I knew you'd do this," she said, "trying to make yourself the victim. You always do." I didn't even glance at her. "If you're going to record, make sure you keep this part," I said. "The one where I finally stop cleaning up after all of you." Her jaw tightened. "You're unbelievable." I looked at her, then really looked. She was dressed perfectly as always, hair curled, makeup sharp. But her eyes looked hunted. "You think I want to see you fail?" I said. "You did that on your own. You lied to me. To everyone." She scoffed. "I lied." "You've been playing saint for years, Clara, acting like you're better than the rest of us." I took a slow step toward her. "No, I just stopped pretending." She lowered the phone, voice rising. "You only came back because you love control. Admit it. You can't stand not being the center of everything." My father cut in, voice sharp. "Grace, stop." But she didn't. "She's jealous, Dad. She's always been jealous." I almost laughed at that, the absurdity of it. "Jealous," I said softly. "You excluded me from your wedding and lied to the world about it. You used my money, my name, and my silence. Tell me, what exactly do I have to be jealous of?" Her face twisted. "You're impossible." "And you're predictable," I said. The room felt heavier. The ticking clock above the fireplace filled the silence. My father's hand rubbed his temple, his voice low. "Clara, I know you're angry, but there's still time to fix this. We can undo it if you retract." "I'm not retracting anything." "Then you're cutting us off." "Yes," I said, "completely." My mother took a step forward. "Please, think about what you're doing. We're still your family. We love you." "Love," I repeated. "You all love the version of me that pays your bills and keeps quiet. But you've never loved me. Just what I could provide." For a moment, no one spoke. The air buzzed with something that wasn't quite anger anymore, something closer to truth. Grace crossed her arms, muttering, "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I said, "but at least it'll be my mistake, not yours." My father moved toward the door, muttering, "I can't do this," and left. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the hall like a gavel. My mother sank onto the edge of the sofa, her hands trembling. "Why couldn't you just wait until after things settled down?" "We're under so much pressure." "Because you didn't wait," I said. You didn't wait to cut me out. Why should I wait to reclaim what's mine? Her voice broke. We made mistakes, but we were trying to protect the family. No, I said quietly. You were protecting your image. Grace stood frozen, still holding her phone, the red light blinking faintly. I looked at her once more. Turn that off, Grace. No one's going to believe your version of this anymore. For once, she obeyed. I turned toward the door, my pulse steady, my breath even. The chandelier above caught the afternoon light, scattering it across the floor. I walked through the streaks of reflection, each step lighter than the one before. Behind me, I could still hear my mother's quiet sobs and Grace's sharp whisper. You ruined us, but they were wrong. I hadn't ruined anything. I'd just stopped pretending it wasn't already broken. There are words you only need to say once. After that silence, we'll do the rest. I opened the door, the cold air from the lake hitting my face. Outside, the water rippled silver beneath the overcast sky. I kept walking until the house disappeared from view. 7 days later, my office television was flashing red banners and breaking headlines. Mitchell Holdings and the Evergreen Foundation under investigation for internal fund transfers. I didn't have the sound on, but the captions were enough. The same anchors who once praised my family for philanthropic leadership now looked delighted to carve us open. The screen shifted to James Parker, local investigative reporter, sharp suit, sharp voice. His tone was precise, detached, merciless. Documents obtained by the Seattle Chronicle confirm overlapping accounts between Mitchell Holdings and its affiliated nonprofit, the Evergreen Foundation. Transfers totaling nearly $400,000 appear to have been redirected from charity funds to cover corporate losses. I leaned back in my chair, watching my family's empire unravel one headline at a time. My assistant poked her head through the door. Should I turn it off? No, I said. Leave it. On screen, they played the clip of my sister's video. Grace sitting in her designer living room, crocodile tears, shining under perfect lighting. My sister Clara has been trying to destroy our family, she said, voice trembling for effect. She's always been jealous of what we've built. I almost smiled. It was predictable. The comment section moved faster than her lies could. Viewers had already dug up screenshots, receipts from her own social media, her tagged photos at fashion shows, luxury handbags purchased under Evergreen's expense account. Someone posted a caption, Grace Mitchell from charity to Chanel. The internet didn't forgive hypocrisy. Within hours, hashtags spread, Mitchell fraud and Gracegate, and the damage was irreversible. The next clip showed her boutique's store window. Workers were taking down the Mitchell & Cooper sign. I muted the TV, the silence in my office louder than before. I picked up my phone and called Maggie. She answered on the second ring. You've seen the news, I'm watching it, I said. They've confirmed your name isn't tied to any of the transactions. I made sure of that. I exhaled. Good. That means they can't drag me down with them. They'll still try, she warned. Families like yours always do. They'll need someone to blame. I know, I said, but they already used me once. It won't work again. There was a pause. Then Maggie said quietly, You sound calm. I am. I said, This time they're speaking for me. I hung up and stared out the window. Downtown Seattle shimmered in the wet sunlight, reflections gliding across the mirrored towers. Everything looked normal, but for my family, the ground had already started cracking. Later that afternoon, I walked past the break room. 2 employees were whispering. When they noticed me, they fell silent, pretending to check their phones. I didn't blame them. Everyone loves a scandal when it isn't theirs. On my desk, my phone vibrated again, another alert. Breaking Mitchell Foundation Board demands Evelyn Mitchell's resignation pending investigation. My mother's portrait flashed on the screen, the same photo used for charity events. Smiling, composed, untouchable. The caption beneath it read, Fall from Grace, Mitchell matriarch, under fire. I turned the phone face down. By evening, the news vans had gathered outside the Lakeview estate. Reporters leaned over the gate's microphones, reaching toward the front door. Cameras caught my father's silhouette through the blinds, pacing. When the reporter shouted, Gita Mitchell, is it true? Your daughter withdrew funding days before the investigation. He pulled the curtain closed. They showed my mother next, refusing to comment, lips tight, hands shaking as she climbed into her car. Then Grace, storming past photographers in dark sunglasses, hair unwashed, the picture of panic. I poured a glass of water and sat on the couch, letting the quiet wrap around me. I didn't feel triumphant. Just hollow. I flipped the TV back on. James Parker's face filled the screen again. Sources close to the family confirm that the company's liquidity crisis began shortly after a major shareholder withdrawal, weeks before the investigation surfaced. Records show the majority shareholder to be Clara Mitchell, who has remained publicly silent throughout the ordeal. He paused for effect. Her timing, intentional or not, may have saved her from legal scrutiny and left the rest of the family exposed. I stared at the screen, my name glowing in the headline. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like distance. The phone buzzed again, message after message. Old classmates, colleagues, journalists looking for a quote. No comment was all I sent if I answered at all. Silence had always been my weapon, but tonight it felt heavier than before. Every word they spoke now, every excuse they scrambled to craft, was another nail they hammered into their own coffin. When people destroy themselves, you don't have to push. You just stop pulling them up. The footage shifted again. Grace's old wedding photos, circulating online captions speculating about the missing sister. Someone dug up a clip of her bragging about family unity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The commentators spoke about betrayal, greed, family fractures. They didn't know me, but they all agreed on one thing. The silence from Clara Mitchell was deafening. Sometimes silence has its own sound. The crackle before collapse, the pause between truth and ruin. I turned off the TV. The screen went black, my reflection staring back. My eyes looked tired, but there was something else there too. Peace. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, echoing off the wet streets. The city kept moving, indifferent to who rose or fell. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. The last headline I saw lingered behind my eyelids, like a ghost. Major shareholder withdraws days before scandal. Clara Mitchell remains silent. They were right. I hadn't said a word, and yet somehow everyone was finally listening. Monday morning began with chaos, though I wasn't there to see it, only to watch it unfold. The TV in my office streamed live coverage from downtown Seattle, where the Mitchell Holdings Tower loomed behind a swarm of reporters and flashing lights. The family name, once a quiet symbol of wealth and respectability, now glared from every headline like a confession. Breaking news, the reporter set her tone a mix of urgency and satisfaction. Mitchell Holdings accounts have been frozen pending investigation. Sources confirm the bank has demanded repayment of more than $2.3 million in outstanding loans. On the split-screen footage played of my father sitting at the head of a long conference table, pale under the sterile fluorescent lights. The room looked colder than I remembered. The executives around him, men who once called him Sir with practiced loyalty, were whispering to each other, shuffling papers, avoiding his eyes. One of them, a senior manager named Paul, stood abruptly. "I can't stay through this," he said, voice tight. "We all know it's over." Then he walked out, leaving his badge on the table. Another followed, and another. The reporter's voice carried over the image. "Sources tell us multiple senior staff have resigned this morning." My father's hands were flat on the table. His mouth moved, but the microphones couldn't pick up what he said. The look on his face wasn't rage, it was disbelief. In the next clip, the camera caught him leaving the building. Reporters pressed in, shouting questions. "Mr. Mitchell, is it true? Your daughter withdrew her investment days before the audit? Did you use the Evergreen Foundation to cover corporate losses?" He kept his head down and pushed through the crowd. The camera followed him to the curb where his car waited. His face appeared in the window just long enough for the flash to catch the sweat on his temple. Then he was gone. I muted the TV and closed my laptop. The silence felt heavier than the noise. That afternoon, the storm shifted to my sister. Grace's face filled the news cycle again this time, blotchy and furious instead of polished. The anchors read statements from the fashion house that had partnered with her boutique. "Effective immediately, we are terminating all brand collaboration with Ms. Grace Mitchell due to reputational concerns." Someone had leaked her meltdown on a call. Her voice sharp, cursing, pleading. "You can't drop me. It's not my fault." When she realized she was being recorded, she hung up and threw her phone. The video ended with the sound of glass breaking. By noon, the internet had devoured her. Influencers who once tagged her for exposure now deleted every photo. Even her so-called friends began posting cryptic messages about toxic people in business. The vultures never wasted time. At my desk, my phone buzzed with a message from Maggie. "The dominoes are falling. Keep your distance. Always do." I replied. Later that day, another clip appeared. This one outside the Lakeview house. A journalist shouted through the gates. "Mrs. Mitchell, any comment on your daughter Clara's withdrawal before the scandal?" My mother appeared for a moment in the doorway, hand gripping the frame. "No comment," she said softly, then shut the door. The cameras didn't move for hours. That night, I watched one last segment before turning the TV off. A panel of analysts debated whether my timing was coincidence or foresight. One of them called it an act of self-preservation. Another called it calculated revenge. I knew it wasn't either. It was clarity. Every dollar they'd borrowed in my name, every favor they'd leveraged behind closed doors, had turned against them. They had built their empire on a foundation of borrowed trust, and I had just stopped lending mine. Each lie they'd told now surfaced in perfect sequence. Each secret unraveled itself without me lifting a finger. I didn't need to call anyone. Karma was efficient. That evening, Grace drove to the Lakeview house. I didn't see it, but I heard from Nora later, who had seen the news crews parked on the street. Grace had stormed inside, mascara-streaked, screaming. "It's all her fault," she shouted. "Clara ruined everything." Mom sat in the living room, face-drawn, eyes rimmed red. "Stop it, Grace," she said weakly. "We did this, not her." Grace's voice cracked. "You're defending her now." "No," Mom whispered. "I'm admitting the truth." Nora said. Grace froze for a second, as if the words hadn't registered. Then she grabbed her purse, muttered something sharp, and walked out. Cameras caught her slamming the car door, hair flying, the image of a woman unraveling. I imagined my mother sitting alone on that couch afterward, the sound of rain tapping against the window. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But pity is just another form of attachment, and I was done with those. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window of my apartment. The city was quiet, lights reflected on the wet pavement like fragments of other lives. On my phone, another alert lit up. Mitchell Holdings stock, delisted. Bankruptcy expected within days. Every decision they'd made, every manipulation, every lie, had led here. I didn't smile. I didn't toast to it. I just breathed. The truth was simple. They had done this to themselves. The world would say I was lucky to have escaped when I did. But luck had nothing to do with it. I had simply stopped pretending not to see the cracks. And when you stop holding up a wall of lies, it doesn't take long before it collapses on its own. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a corner booth at a quiet diner in Belltown, the kind of place where the hum of coffee machines filled the pauses between thoughts. The morning paper lay open in front of me, my family's faces stretched across the front page under the headline, "The Fall of the Mitchell Empire." Their smiles, old photos from charity galas and company parties, looked artificial, now brittle. I traced the edge of the page with my finger, then folded it shut just as the doorbell chimed. Daniel walked in. He looked nothing like the polished man who'd once stood beside my sister in family portraits. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. When he spotted me, he hesitated, then approached. "Clara," he said softly, standing beside the table. "Thanks for agreeing to meet." I didn't smile. "You said it was important." "It is." He slid into the booth across from me and set a thick envelope on the table. His hands lingered there for a moment before he let go. "You should see this. I didn't reach for it. What is it?" "Proof," he said, "about what they did, Grace and your mother." I stared at him, searching for guilt, for sincerity. "You'll have to be more specific," I said. "They've done a lot lately." He sighed. "It's a contract. A transfer between the Evergreen Foundation and Mitchell Holdings. Both their signatures are on it. It's the paper trail that ties the whole fraud together." Finally, I reached for the envelope and opened it. Inside were photocopies of transaction forms, account numbers, bank stamps. And there they were. 2 signatures I'd known my entire life. Grace's dramatic loops, my mother's careful precision. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Daniel's voice filled the silence. "I didn't know about it until last week. I found the copies while going through Grace's office. She told me to stay out of it. Said I didn't understand. And you believed her," I said quietly. "I wanted to," he admitted. "But she's not the same anymore. The person I married would never have done this." I closed the envelope, pushing it back toward him. "Keep it. I don't need proof. I already know who they are. Clara." I looked at him then, calm but sharp. "You don't have to explain. You didn't sign those papers. They did. They made their choices and I made mine." He leaned forward. "Grace has lost everything. She's spiraling. I'm worried about her. You should be." I said not unkindly. But you can't save someone who keeps choosing the fire. He swallowed, eyes downcast. You're right. For a while, neither of us said anything. The waitress refilled our coffee cups, glancing at us curiously before walking away. Daniel rubbed his temples. When the story broke, I thought about calling you. I almost did, but I didn't know what to say. You just said it, I replied. That's enough. He looked up at me, the corner of his mouth tightening. You've changed. I had to. I said, survival does that. He nodded slowly. You always saw things clearly. Grace hated that about you. I gave a faint smile. She mistook clarity for arrogance. Daniel's eyes softened. I'm sorry, Clara, for not seeing it sooner. Don't apologize for them, I said. You're not their keeper. He slid the envelope toward me again. Take it. You might need it. This time I didn't refuse. I tucked it into my bag. All right, he exhaled. Grace told me you'd come after us, that you wanted revenge. I said, finishing my coffee. I just stopped protecting them. That's not revenge, he murmured. No, I said. It's release. He looked at me for a moment like he was trying to recognize the version of me he remembered from holidays and polite dinners. That woman, the one who smiled, mediated, paid, forgave, was gone. I saw the realization dawn in his eyes, followed by something that looked like respect. When he stood, he looked lighter, as if saying the words had taken a weight off his shoulders. You're stronger than any of them gave you credit for. I know, I said simply. He hesitated before leaving. Grace won't recover from this, he said. I'm not sure any of them will. They'll survive, I said, just not in the way they wanted. He nodded once, slid a few bills under his empty cup, and left. I sat there a few minutes longer, listening to the low hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the rain starting again outside. The envelope in my bag felt heavier than it should. Forgiveness and closure aren't the same thing. Forgiveness is for them. Closure is for me. I'd already chosen which one I wanted. I pulled on my coat and stepped out into the drizzle. The street smelled like wet asphalt and espresso. The sky hung low and gray, pressing close to the city skyline. As I walked toward the car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Maggie. Reports moving to civil court. They'll announce hearings soon. Be ready. I typed back, always am. A gust of wind swept down the street, flipping my hair across my face. I pushed it back, gripping my coat tighter. Somewhere behind me, a newspaper stand rattled in the breeze, the front page catching the light under a street lamp. Our family name still printed in bold. I didn't stop to look this time. I'd already read enough. The doorbell rang just after sunrise. The sound cut through the fog outside my apartment, pulling me from the half-silence of early morning. When I opened the door, a postal worker stood there holding a small beige envelope. Signature, please, he said. His breath fogged in the cold air. I signed without thinking, thanked him, and closed the door. The envelope was light, handwritten, the familiar slanted script on the front, making my chest tighten. From Clara Mitchell. I carried it to the table and sat down. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic below. For a long time, I just stared at it. The handwriting looked weaker, shakier than it used to. I turned it over, slid my thumb under the flap, and unfolded the letter inside. Clara, my daughter. It began. I'm writing this from a small apartment in Tacoma. The foundation has been frozen. The accounts are gone. The Lakeview house will be sold soon. I don't have much left, money or reputation. But I have time finally to think. My eyes moved slowly over each word, the pen strokes uneven. You were right. I cared more about how people saw us than who we were. I thought appearances could hold a family together, but I was wrong. I chose status, and I lost you. I hope someday you can forgive me even if I don't deserve it. Love, Mom. The letter trembled slightly in my hands, though I couldn't tell if it was her hand that had shaken when writing it, or mine now. I leaned back, the sound of the rain beginning to patter against the windows. My eyes traced the ceiling until they caught the soft light filtering in. I let the quiet settle again before reading it once more, slower this time. The meaning heavier with each line. She was living in Tacoma now. I pictured her in a small apartment with peeling wallpaper, the kind she would have once looked down on. No staff, no grand piano, no marble counters. Just her and her thoughts, finally alone, with the silence she had built for herself. A memory surfaced. I was 10 years old, standing in our living room, dressed in a sky-blue dress that matched my mother's. We were getting ready for a charity gala. She'd asked Grace to stand next to her in the family photo, telling me gently, Let your sister stand in front. Darling. The lights always hit her better. Grace had smiled, radiant, camera ready. I'd stepped aside, watching the flash go off. It was a small thing, maybe, but even then, I knew. It wasn't about the light. It was about being seen. Back then, I didn't understand the difference between being invisible and being safe. Now I did. I placed the letter on the table beside the coffee cup and stared at it. There were no excuses in her words, no manipulation. Just confession. Too late, but honest. I rose, walked to the shelf by the window, and picked up a framed photo that had survived every move, every change. It was us. My parents, Grace and me, standing in front of the Lakeview house. Dad's arm around Mom's shoulder, Grace in the center, holding flowers, me off to the side, slightly out of frame. We were all smiling, but now I saw what was really there, the distance between us hidden in plain sight. I placed the photo next to the letter. Together, they looked like a story that had finally finished itself. Forgiveness is complicated. People think it's a door you open, but sometimes it's just a window you stop looking out of. I poured myself a glass of water, took a sip, then turned the letter face down. The sky outside had turned gray again. Through the window, the city blurred in the mist, towers fading into the clouds. I rested my forehead against the glass. The temperature was cool, grounding. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger takes energy, and I'd given them enough of mine already. What was left now was quieter. Something closer to sadness, but not grief. More like release. The clock ticked behind me. The rain grew heavier, drumming softly against the building. There was a strange comfort in knowing she'd written to me, not because she wanted something, but because she finally understood what she'd lost. She had always chased approval, but in the end, the only person she wanted to hear from was the daughter she'd silenced. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. I opened the drawer beside my desk and placed it inside next to a few other remnants of the past. A small key from the Lakeview gate, an old check stub from when I'd saved them once before. Artifacts of a life I'd already buried. When I closed the drawer, the sound felt final. Outside, the fog thickened until the skyline disappeared entirely. I stood there watching the rain streak down the glass, each drop sliding into another until they became one. Somewhere beneath that quiet, I could almost hear her voice again. Warm, distant, saying my name the way she used to when she needed me to fix something, only this time there was nothing left to fix. The letter had said everything words could say, and the silence that followed said the rest. 2 weeks later, the office buzzed with the steady rhythm of work. Voices overlapped, screens flickered with slides, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. Mitchell events Kimbamug had never been busier. I stood at the head of the conference table, laptop open, speaking to faces from half a dozen countries through the glow of a Zoom call. And with your approval, I said, glancing at the clock in the corner of the screen, we'll finalize the logistics for the San Francisco Corporate Summit next quarter. A chorus of voices responded, agreement, laughter, closing remarks. I smiled, thanked them, and ended the call. The room fell quiet, just the low hum of the city outside the windows. I poured the rest of my coffee into the sink, rinsed the cup, and leaned against the counter. The city looked golden through the glass, washed in late afternoon light. The door opened, and Maggie stepped in her heels, clicking lightly against the floor. She held a folded newspaper under her arm, expression unreadable. "You've been busy," she said. "Trying to be," I replied. "It keeps me from thinking too much." She unfolded the paper and placed it on my desk. The headline stared up at me. Mitchell family sells Lakeview estate. A photo showed the house. Empty windows, a for sale sign tilted in the wind. They sold it, I asked. Yesterday, Maggie said, below market value, just enough to clear back taxes and outstanding debts. I picked up the paper, scanning the article. There was no mention of me, not even a hint. The reporter had focused on the fall of a once beloved family dynasty. My parents' names. Grace's photo. The words liquidation and final assets. I folded the paper and set it aside. Good, I said quietly. Now they know what silence costs. Maggie's lips curved into a half smile. You've won, you know. I shook my head. No. Winning means someone else was still competing. I stopped playing a long time ago. She studied me for a moment. So what do you call it then? Freedom, I said. Her smile softened. I can live with that. We sat for a while in the stillness that followed. She told me briefly about the civil case timeline, how the investigations were wrapping up, how the family's accounts were nearly empty. I listened, but my mind was elsewhere, on what comes after endings. When she left, I stayed by the window watching the flow of people below, a man hurrying across the street with an umbrella, a couple sharing a pastry by a food truck, a delivery van unloading boxes. Normal life moving forward. My phone rang on the desk. I picked it up. Ms. Mitchell. The woman's voice was crisp, professional. This is Lauren from the Pacific Women's Leadership Network. We've been following your story, the company you've built, how you've managed to grow despite adversity. Despite family scandal, I finished for her, my tone dry but polite. She laughed softly. You said it, not me. We're hosting a conference in Los Angeles next month on female entrepreneurship. We'd love for you to speak about independence and resilience, how you built something that's entirely yours. I hesitated. Public speaking was never my favorite thing, but the idea of standing in front of a room full of women who'd probably faced the same kind of condescension and betrayal, it felt right. I'll do it, I said. That's wonderful, she said. We'll send details this week. After the call, I set the phone down, still smiling faintly. The word independence lingered in my head. It didn't sound like rebellion anymore. It sounded like peace. I poured another cup of coffee, watching the steam rise. On my desk, the contract for the San Francisco Summit lay signed, the company logo embossed at the top. Mitchell Events Co., the only Mitchell name that hadn't burned. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I founded it 8 years ago, I'd chosen to keep my last name for practical reasons, recognition, legacy, leverage. Back then it had felt like an anchor. Now it was proof that you could reshape even the things that once hurt you. The afternoon sunlight shifted, filling the room with warmth. I walked toward the window again, hands in my pockets, gazing at the skyline. Revenge had never been about winning. People think it's a battle, a scoreboard, but it isn't. It's the quiet reclaiming of space that was stolen from you. The realization that you don't owe anyone your forgiveness or your suffering. They had taken years of my life, my money, my trust. I couldn't get any of that back. But what I could reclaim was this, my stillness, my breath, my clarity. The city below began to glow as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The office was almost empty now, my team heading home one by one, their laughter echoing faintly from the hallway. I thought about the Lakeview house one last time. The marble stairs, the glass walls, the view of the lake at sunset. They'd believed it meant permanence. But permanence is just another illusion, one that cracks the moment truth walks in. Freedom doesn't announce itself. It's quiet. It waits. Then one morning you wake up and realize it's already there, sitting beside you while you drink your coffee, asking for nothing in return. I turned off the lights, leaving only the soft amber glow from the skyline spilling across the office floor. Standing there, I caught my reflection in the glass. Steady, calm, no longer haunted. The kind of peace that doesn't need to be explained. The sun finally disappeared, and Seattle melted into twilight. I stood still for another moment, watching the colors fade. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of endings, of beginnings, of space finally reclaimed. A week later, the courthouse steps were a battlefield of cameras and microphones. The morning air was sharp, heavy with the smell of wet concrete and flashbulb heat. Vans lined the street outside King County Civil Court, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters shouted names as people filed through security, each voice echoing against the marble facade. Inside, the courtroom felt colder, quieter, too small for the weight it held. I sat behind the front row with Maggie beside me, our seats angled just enough to see the bench. Across the aisle, my parents and Grace sat shoulder to shoulder at the defense table, pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Their lawyer whispered urgently, shuffling papers, but none of them were listening. They just stared forward. The judge entered. Harris, tall, stern, a presence that silenced the room before he even spoke. This hearing concerns the matter of Mitchell Holdings and the Evergreen Foundation, he said. His voice was calm, unhurried, but every word cut through the still air. I watched my father's shoulders stiffen. He was wearing his old navy suit, the one he used for board meetings. It hung loose now, too big for him. Evelyn's pearls looked out of place against her pale skin. Grace sat in the middle, hands clenched in her lap, mascara smudged under her eyes. She wasn't filming this time. The court clerk began reading the charges: misappropriation of charitable funds, internal transfer violations, breach of trust. The list went on and on, a rhythm of destruction that sounded almost clinical, each word built on the last like the slow tolling of a bell. When the clerk finished, Judge Harris cleared his throat. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, he began. This court finds Mitchell Holdings in violation of federal and state financial regulations. Assets will be seized and liquidated to settle outstanding debts. He turned a page. The Evergreen Foundation is hereby suspended indefinitely, pending further investigation. My mother's breath caught audibly. The room went still. The sound of pens clicking and pages turning from the press row filled the silence. Harris continued, his tone unchanged. Personal holdings connected to fraudulent transfers are also subject to audit and recovery. This includes the Lakeview property previously sold below market value. Grace leaned toward her lawyer, whispering something frantic. He shook his head slowly. The judge looked over the rim of his glasses. This decision is final. And just like that, it was over. Years of power and image, gone in a paragraph. Cameras clicked as Harris stood. The bailiff called for order, but it didn't matter. The moment had already passed. I looked across the room at them one last time. My father sat rigid, his hand trembling as he reached for his glasses. My mother's head was bowed, her lips moving soundlessly. Grace just stared ahead as if waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. There was no anger left in me. No satisfaction either. Just a quiet finality, the kind that settles after a storm. Maggie leaned closer. "You ready to go?" I nodded. We stood as the courtroom emptied, the noise outside swelling again. I could hear reporters calling my name as we approached the doors. Their voices merging into a blur. Clara. "Did you know? Were you involved? What's your statement?" I didn't answer. The sound of camera shutters followed us down the hall. Maggie kept her pace steady beside me, shielding me when someone stepped too close. At the entrance, the flash of light hit first, bright, disorienting. I raised a hand slightly, not to hide, but to steady myself. The cold air from Elliott Bay swept through the plaza, carrying the scent of salt and metal. The crowd pressed forward, but the security guards held them back. "Ms. Mitchell, are you happy with the ruling?" one reporter shouted. I stopped for just a second, the words sinking in. Happy. No, happiness wasn't the right word. This wasn't joy. It was closure. I walked down the courthouse steps without answering. The marble beneath my heels was slick from morning drizzle. My breath clouded faintly in the air. Maggie said something I didn't catch, probably a reminder to stay composed, but I didn't need reminding. Halfway down, I paused. The noise behind me dulled, replaced by the muted hum of traffic below. The bay stretched beyond the city skyline, its surface catching the weak afternoon light. They were right behind those walls, the family that had once defined me, now strangers bound by shame instead of blood. For a moment, I wondered if they'd finally understand what silence felt like, the way it echoed louder than any defense ever could. 1 week ago, they still believed they could recover, rebuild, control the story. Now they sat frozen not by anger, but by the realization that it was gone. Every illusion, every ounce of borrowed dignity. I breathed in deeply, the air cold and clean. I didn't turn back. There was nothing there to face anymore. As I reached the last step, sunlight broke through the clouds, pale but persistent. It brushed across my shoulders, warm enough to remind me of what freedom could feel like. The city kept moving. Cars, honking pedestrians rushing by, someone laughing on a phone nearby. Life continued, indifferent and alive. I stood still for a few seconds longer, letting it all wash over me. The noise, the wind, the light. When I finally stepped forward, it wasn't out of triumph. It was simply because I could. Sunday morning came soft and pale. The air smelled of salt and cedar, and the waves along Alki Beach moved slow and deliberate, as if even the ocean had decided to rest. I walked along the shoreline beside Aunt Nora, our shoes dangling from our hands, the cool sand pressing between our toes. The sky stretched wide above Seattle's skyline, blue fading into gold. We didn't talk for a long while. The quiet between us was easy, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The only sounds were the gulls overhead and the hush of waves rolling in and out, endless and different. Nora finally broke the silence. "So," she said, her voice gentle, "what happens now, kiddo?" I smiled, small and certain. Now I looked out toward the water, sunlight flashing across the surface like shattered glass. I live, I work, and I don't look back. She nodded, slowly studying me. That sounds like peace. It is, I said, for the first time in a long time. We walked a few more steps before my phone buzzed in my pocket. I hesitated before checking it. The headline glowed across the screen: Mitchell Holdings officially declared bankrupt. Assets fully liquidated. For a moment, I just stared at the words. They didn't sting. They didn't thrill me either. They were simply a fact, an ending that had been waiting to happen. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my coat. The sound of the tide filled the space the news might have occupied. Nora glanced at me. Bad news. I shook my head. Just the last page turning. We kept walking. The wind picked up, tugging at my hair, carrying the faint scent of coffee from the cafe near the pier. The city was waking behind us. Runners, families with strollers, dogs chasing tennis balls. Life went on. I thought about my family. My mother in Tacoma, folding her regrets into letters I'd never answer. My father somewhere quieter, probably planning ways to disappear from the press. Grace, who I hadn't heard from since the trial, vanished from social media. Her boutique closed her name now, a cautionary tale. They were still out there living with the aftermath they'd built. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't wish them anything at all. I'd finally reached the point where they didn't occupy space in my mind. That I realized was the real victory. They had laughed once back at that dinner table when they thought they'd cut me out for good. Don't worry about it. It already happened last week. I could still hear Grace's voice, light and cruel. But time has a way of leveling cruelty. A week later, they were the ones erased, by their own choices, their own silence. The ocean shimmered under the sun. I bent to pick up a small piece of driftwood smooth from years of waves, and tossed it back into the surf. They always thought I'd break, I said quietly. Nora looked at me, her gray eyes soft but steady. Maybe they confused breaking with becoming someone new. I smiled. Maybe. We reached a stretch of beach where the sand met scattered shells. Nora stopped and turned toward me. You know I'm proud of you, not for what happened to them, but for what you didn't let happen to you. That made me pause. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. It took me a while to understand that difference. She reached for my hand and gave it a squeeze. Understanding is enough. For a while we just stood there watching the waves pull in and retreat, endless rhythm, no beginning or end. The sunlight danced across the ripples, each reflection brief but beautiful. I took a deep breath, feeling the salt sting my lungs. My voice was barely above a whisper. I think silence was always the lesson. Nora tilted her head. What do you mean I used to think revenge was loud? I said. That you had to shout to be heard to prove you'd survived. But I was wrong. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing you can leave behind. She smiled, nodding. You finally sound like someone free. I am, I said. That's the part they'll never understand. The breeze grew stronger, brushing the hem of my coat. Behind us, the sound of laughter drifted from a group of children playing in the surf. It made me think of how much life continues even after the worst storms pass. I turned back towards the water one last time. The horizon stretched wide, the sun breaking fully through the clouds, now gold spilling over the waves. The kind of morning that makes everything, every bruise, every scar, feel like part of something larger. They once laughed when they erased me from their picture. A week later, that picture collapsed. I didn't destroy them. I just stepped out of the frame and let the truth develop on its own. I closed my eyes, letting the wind move through my hair. When I opened them again, Nora was still beside me, quiet, her face calm. We didn't need to say anything else. The silence was enough. I started walking again, slower this time. The sand shifted beneath my feet, cool and soft. The light followed me as I moved down the beach, the tide whispering along the shore, like it was carrying the last pieces of the past away. Freedom doesn't look like triumph. It looks like breathing without remembering who tried to steal your air. And in that moment, as the morning settled into stillness, I realized something simple but final. Silence wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of peace. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or erased, remember this. You don't have to prove them wrong. Sometimes silence is the loudest way to be right.